Hello, class. We're to Chapter 26, The Cold War Abroad and at Home, 1945 to 1960. So we're talking about a 15-year period. It's also the period of time most associated with the baby boomers, although baby boomers, I guess, could go a little bit longer on. I'm going to try not to be real long-winded on this. I'm going to try to keep this within 15 minutes, but the Cold War is, in my mind, one of the more fascinating periods of history, so I may try to sort of carry us down some rabbit trails from time to time, but let's just see what we can get done today. All right, so as we've been doing with these chronologies, let's just start with 1946. Actually, let's back up just a little bit. In the end of World War II, 1945 sees the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Harry Truman becomes the next president of the United States. Harry Truman is also the last president we have had that did not have a college degree, but he was highly educated. Probably knew more about history than most college professors do today because he was always reading books. It was Truman that made the decision to drop the bombs on Japan, and it was Truman that sort of ratcheted up the Cold War between us and the Soviet Union. Now, you might ask the question, well, I thought we were allies with the Soviet Union during World War II. Well, if you've ever heard the expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that's exactly what was happening here. We disagreed with Russia on just about everything, but Hitler was the primary antagonist in World War II, and us and Russia both felt about the same way, and so we allied together to defeat Hitler and Nazi Germany and the totalitarian of Nazi Germany and their allies. In 1946, however, Truman's trying to get his head wrapped around exactly what the ideology of the Soviet Union is. So he turns to a U.S. ambassador by the name of George Kennan. George Kennan is probably not the guy that you would want to invite to your party. He was kind of dull. He was very much an introvert. He was a book nerd. He liked to read. He spoke Russian, and that had landed him a position to be an American ambassador in Russia. He had vacation getaways at Stalin's Dhaka on the Black Sea. He had married a Russian woman, and if there is an American that understood the mindset of the Russians, it was George Kennan. And so in 1946, George Kennan writes what was called the Long Telegram. He did not put his name to it, but it was about 40. It was about I think it was around like 4,400 words, or maybe even longer. A sizable work to go across the telegrams, and it pretty much laid out this viewpoint for the Soviet Union, that communism that does not expand dies, and that the Soviet Union must expand if the communism that it espoused was going to continue. And so George Kennan indirectly is calling for something called containment, that we may not be able to do anything about communism where it is, but we can keep it from spreading. We can quarantine it into one spot, if you will. 1946, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill had been Prime Minister of Great Britain, but near the end, right after World War II is over, he's voted out by the English Parliament. Churchill visits the United States. He visits a little college in Fulton, Missouri, where he makes his Iron Curtain speech, where he says from one part of Europe to the other, an Iron Curtain has fallen, and on one side is freedom, and on the other side oppression. And he's warning Americans that this is going to be the struggle of the age. Republicans win control of Congress in 1946. Throughout most of Roosevelt's years, the Republicans had been a minority party. They're starting to make inroads into the Congress again. 1947, Truman is going to get calls out of Greece and Turkey that communist rebels are trying to overthrow the governments there. Greece and Turkey had both been hit hard in World War II. Food supplies were running low. They just did not have what they needed to get back on their feet. And so Truman asked the Congress to designate money for the purchasing of livestock, milk goats, draft animals, seeds, whatever might be needed, and also possibly military support to try to make sure that these communist rebels don't overthrow the duly elected governments of Greece and Turkey. The Federal Employee Loyalty Program is put into place because increasingly we're seeing more and more worry that there are communists inside the State Department and inside other governmental agencies in the bureaucracy. The National Security Act, the NSA, establishes the National Security Council to advise President Truman and future presidents on precisely what we need to do to handle both these Cold War issues at home and also abroad. HUAC stands for the House Un-American Activities Committee. And HUAC was one of its primary members was future President Richard Nixon. And they're going to begin to hold hearings on Hollywood. Looking back at movies in the 1940s, it had been highly praising of Russia. Well, Russia's not our friend anymore. So the question starts to be, are there people in Hollywood that are communist sympathizers? Are there people in Hollywood that are trying to pass a communist agenda to the American people? And so they're investigating this. 10 members of the Hollywood establishment are going to call the Hollywood 10 simply refuse to testify. They're going to be blacklisted, and many of them are not going to work for quite a number of years. There's a little known Jim Carrey movie that you might look at that I think is really good when we start looking at this sort of Red Scare period. It's called The Majestic. He's a Hollywood producer, screenwriter, and he gets into all kinds of trouble in this period. So if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If not, go look it up. It's a good movie. 1948. The state of Israel is founded. Israel had been, or the area where Israel had historically been. Of course, Israel had been destroyed by the Romans many centuries before, and the people of Israel had been dispersed, called the diaspora. But in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, which we really haven't talked about much together, but you have read about it as you move through this. In the aftermath of the war and the Holocaust, Great Britain is going to take land that they had controlled in Palestine and set aside that area as a homeland for the Jewish people. This is highly supported by the United States and President Truman. 1948, one thing we have not talked about, but you should know by now, is in the aftermath of the war, Germany is divided. At Potsdam, Germany is divided at the Potsdam Conference. Germany is divided into two sections. East Germany, which is controlled by the Soviet Union, and Western Germany, which is divided between the United States, France, and Britain. And each country is rebuilding their own as they see fit, but the western portion, under the United States, England, and France, are going to reunite very quickly. Also divided was Berlin. Now, Berlin is squarely in eastern Germany, but it's also divided. And the intention was to form up one country again very soon, but the Soviet Union is rebuilding their portion, including East Berlin and all of Eastern Europe, rebuilding it as sort of a communist state. In an attempt to drive the United States and the other Western allies out of Berlin, Stalin shuts the gates. No traffic in, no traffic out of West Berlin. So here you have this little sort of island of democracy surrounded by a sea of red communism. Well, Truman says, we can't let Berlin go. And so for about 15 months, aircraft are flying 24/7. They're flying supplies into West Berlin and keeping West Berlin alive. Now, please do not start immediately thinking about the Berlin Wall. That won't be built until 1961. The United States Congress approves what is called the Marshall Plan, named for Secretary of State George C. Marshall. The Marshall Plan is basically saying we need to supply aid to war-torn Europe, because if we can supply them aid, if we can keep them fed and keep the people satisfied, they won't turn to communism like so many other impoverished countries have done, because the communism always looks good to the poorest populations. Communist leaders will be put on trial in the United States under what is called the Smith Act, so certainly not a high point for civil liberties in the United States. 1949, the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is going to be established. The United States, and it's originally about 10 other nations, and it's going to place the those nations under the United States nuclear shield. 1949, we're the only nation that has atomic weaponry. Now that's going to change very soon, but 1949, we're the only ones. East and West Germany are going to officially become separate nations, and we've talked about that before. 1949, communism. There's a civil war has been going on in China for quite some time, and the World War II sort of put it on pause. But it resumes, and the communists are going to win in China, driving out Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists. And this is going to establish the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and his followers flee to Taiwan, which is a reason that China and Taiwan are still at odds today. 1949, the Soviet Union develops their own atomic bomb, and we began to realize that there are spies in Los Alamos and in the Manhattan Project. Of course, that was what had been put into place to develop our atomic bomb. And that was discovered in 1950. And an investigation begins to go underway. How did the Russians get this information? Joseph McCarthy is a United States senator from Wisconsin, I believe, and he launches into an anti-communist crusade, which is the high point of what is known as the Second Red Scare, or McCarthyism. And he's accusing people of being communists, some of which might be, some of which are not, some of which just may have spoken out against some issue that they didn't see as right. About the same time in here, maybe a few years before, we have the Alger Hiss affair. Alger Hiss was a member of the United States State Department. He's accused by Whittaker Chambers of being a communist, and sure enough, he was. And so it sort of throws fuel on the fire. 1950, the Korean War begins. It begins during, of course, Truman is the president now. But it will not end until it'll actually end under President Eisenhower, who will be elected in 1952. The Truman will accept NSC, stands for National Security Council 68 report, which basically says we are not prepared to go to war with the Russians or any of the communist nations, and therefore we need to begin to sort of bulk up our readiness. 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a married couple who Julius worked in Los Alamos or with the Manhattan Project. He's accused by his brother-in-law actually of being a communist and of passing secrets to the Russians. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are both found guilty of espionage and will be put to death. 1952, the first U.S. Detonates the first hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb is much, much more powerful than the original atomic bomb. Dwight Eisenhower is elected president in 1952. And he basically tells the Koreans that if you don't come to the table and let's talk about things, we will basically drop a whole bunch of bombs on your head. And they come to the table, and we have the divided Korea that we have today as a result, and the demilitarized zone between them. Which sounds like there might be some talks that may be breaking that down recently. I don't know, we'll have to see where that goes. 1954, McCarthy is going to institute the Army McCarthy hearings, and he begins to accuse the Army of having communists in its ranks. Now, this is the same Army that just fought the Korean War, fought World War II, and this is a step too far. And McCarthy's going to be censored. He goes home, and pretty much within about a year dies of alcoholism. 1956, the Suez Crisis. The British control the Suez Canal and parts of Egypt. Well, the Egyptians are going to seize the canal, and we sort of stay out of that. In fact, my family's watching the series The Crown on Netflix, and just the other night they were dealing with the Suez Crisis in 1956. If you've seen that, you know what I'm talking about. 1957, the Eisenhower Doctrine is announced that basically we will assist any country that's trying to turn against communism, and we're mainly looking at the Middle East at this particular point. 1959, Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution institutes communism in Cuba, and of course it still is there today, and we'll get to in a future chapter the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in 1960, American spy planes flying over Russia, trying to detect evidence of nuclear activity, nuclear testing, are going to shoot down an American spy plane, a U-2, Eisenhower says, no, it's not our plane. Well, then they produce the pilot, and yes, sure enough, it is. And that's going to break down some major talks scheduled in 1960. All right, guys, that's a real quick rundown of this chapter. I hope all is well. Stay tuned for the next one. Thanks so much.